Good evening. I am Brad Braxton, the director of the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. It is a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the National Museum. We are delighted to collaborate with our partners, the Pew Research Center, Spelman College, and the phenomenal leaders who will talk with us tonight. We are especially grateful for the Lilly Endowment for its generous underwriting of this audacious undertaking. Tonight, we will examine how socially engaged and social media savvy African American millennials are defining and redefining spirituality. We also will explore how they are hosting and cooperating with sacred energy to refashion a world that is more equitable, inclusive, and compassionate. This is the second of 6 episodes of this conversation. We launched the conversation series in Los Angeles in August 2018. That first conversation was raucous, robust, righteous, and at times a little rowdy. And we expect nothing less tonight. It is fitting that we probe these sacred topics in a sacred place like Spelman College. Courageous, young freedom fighters whose feet trod on the soil of Spelman and Morehouse and the broader institutions of the AUC valiantly redeemed the soul of America and changed the world in a heroic struggle for freedom decades ago. Time moves on. The torch has been passed. Thus, we are eager to hear how this generation of courageous young freedom fighters are struggling to redeem the soul of America and change the world. As they lead us forward, we can hear the cheering of the ancestors if we listen carefully with our third ear. On my way to freedom, I shall not be moved. On my way to freedom, I shall not be moved, just like a tree planted by the waters. I shall not be moved. Permit me now to introduce my colleague at the center, the visionary who orchestrated this innovative initiative and the moderator for our conversation, Teddy Reeves. Teddy is a native of North Carolina. He holds a bachelor's degree from Hampton University and a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Seminary. He is a Ph.D. candidate at Fordham University, an ordained clergy person, and a leading millennial voice. Teddy, lead us afresh down freedom's highway.
Good evening. Good evening. And welcome to God Talk. We are indeed excited to have you here on the campus of historic Spelman College in Sisters Chapel. We want to again echo the words of Reverend Dr. Brad Braxton on thanking everyone for coming out, and our partners, Pew Research Center, and our partners, Spelman College, for hosting us here. We are indeed in for a treat this evening of robust conversation with amazing panelists. So good evening and welcome to God Talk. As we jump right into our first conversation for the evening, Faith in Context, I want to introduce our panelists for this evening. Starting on my right, I want to introduce Dr. Bashir Muhammad. Dr. Bashir Muhammad is a senior researcher at the Pew Research Center. He is involved with the design and implementation of many of the center's domestic religion polls. He specializes in studying religious minorities in the U.S. with a specific focus on Muslim Americans. Please welcome Dr. Bashir Muhammad. Our next panelist, Tiffany Tucker, is a Detroit native that has called Metro Atlanta home for almost 20 years. She attended Savannah State University and now works in the healthcare industry. She is an avid hiker, vegan, and a proud out lesbian. Tiffany advocates for the rights of persons of trans identities. Outside of her work, Tiffany spends her free time volunteering with Black Nonbelievers Incorporated, Recovering from Religion, and a host of other organizations. Please welcome Tiffany Tucker. Our next panelist, Reverend Dr. Michelle Guidry, is the Dean of Sisters Chapel at Spelman College and the Director of the Wisdom Center. She is a graduate of Clark Atlanta University with her BA, and Yale Divinity School with a Master's of Divinity in 2010, and a graduate of Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, where she completed her doctorate of philosophy in the area of liturgical studies with a concentration in homiletics. She is the creator of She Preaches, a virtual community of professional development organizations that aspires to uplift African American millennial women in ministry. Please welcome Reverend Dr. Michelle Guidry. Next, we have Reverend Michael Wortham, is a pastor with a hip-hop sensibility that is fused by his love of God and hip-hop culture to reach people seeking to deepen their spiritual fight for justice, yet skeptical of religious institutions. He is a native of Fairfield, Alabama, and holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in finance from the best university in the world, Hampton University, and a Master of Divinity degree with a concentration in race and religion from the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Please welcome Reverend Michael Wortham. Our next panelist is Ihklas Saleem, is the Director of Digital Content for Education Post. In addition to her commitment to ensuring low-income students of color have access to the best education possible, she also thinks a lot about the intersection of race, gender, and Muslim life in America, which she explores on the Identity Politics podcast. She is a graduate of Wellesley College and holds a Master's in Theological Studies from Harvard University. Please welcome Ihklas Saleem. And last but not least, we have the Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock. He has served as the senior pastor of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, the spiritual home of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. since 2005. Dr. Warnock graduated from Morehouse College, receiving a Bachelor's of Arts degree in psychology. He also holds a Master's of Divinity and a Master's of Philosophy and a Doctorate of Philosophy degree from Union Theological Seminary in New York City. His first book, entitled The Divided Mind of the Black Church, Theology, Piety, and Public Witness, was released in 2014. Please help me welcome all of our panelists this evening. So let's jump into this hot conversation. Y'all ready for it? All right, I know that's what y'all came for this evening. So my first question, I really want to start with Dr. Muhammad in posing this questioning and really opening up to the panelists. What is the current state of millennial participation in organized faith traditions? And what does it mean? There has been a lot of talk about millennials disengaging with faith, Sociologists have weighed in on it. Pew's weighed in on it. Do you see this as something that is real or imaginary? And based on your own experiences and based on data. So I want to start with you, Dr. Muhammad. Is this an issue that millennials are indeed disengaging with faith traditions?
Well, it certainly is the case that we see millennials disengaging in a lot of different ways. One way you can look at this is by comparing African-American millennials to their elders, to older blacks, older African-Americans. And what we see is that by a whole range of measures, African-American millennials are less religious than their elders. Now, it's worth noting, though, while that's true, it's also true that they're more religious than their non-black peers. So if you compare African-Americans to whites, you see that African-Americans seem more religious. And this holds for millennials the same way it holds for older generations. If we can get can we look at some of the graphics? If we can go to that first slide. And this pattern holds for a variety of measures. You can look at how important they say religion is in their lives. You can look at whether they are affiliated with a religious tradition. You can look at whether they attend religious services. By all these measures, you see that African-American millennials are at this intersection, at this crossroads, where they're more religious than their peers, but less religious than their elders.
And why do you think that is?
There have been a lot of reasons that have been given for that. One that was given for years and years was that people would say, oh, well, but it's just because they're young. Oh, when they get older, they'll become more religious as well. And that, the data shows, is just not true. If we go to the next slide, what you see is that over time, millennials have become less religious. So we first started hearing this back in 2006, 2007, when millennials, by and large, were in their teens, in their 20s, and once they get older, once they have families, they'll come to church, they'll come to, and that's not what we see. We see as millennials, as they've gotten older, have gotten further from religion, have gotten less affiliated over time. So we see this pattern, and we see this pattern across the board, and we see a pattern of not only are they less religious, but that they're becoming less religious.
So in that data, when we're talking about millennials are disengaging and becoming less religious, what's happening with the rise of that unaffiliated number, right, and that unaffiliated demographic?
So this is one thing that I think a number of folks on the panel have a lot to jump in on. So I'll just make one last point, which is that the unaffiliated number is absolutely rising compared to older generations and over time among the millennials. But this disaffiliation with organized religion is not a distancing from God. What we don't see is people in droves becoming atheists. We see more of that, but most are just, when you ask what their religion is, say, I'm nothing in particular. I have concerns about the organizations, I have concerns about the institutions, I don't need those institutions, but I still believe. And I feel like I can believe without belonging to an institution. That's what we see even more. We also do see some more people who are completely atheists, reject any affiliation with religion or with God, and have a very different set of beliefs. But more so than that, we see people who retain belief but want a distance from the organizations.
So I really want to open this up to the group, as it is, right, we have this data that's saying we are, as a millennial, right, that we are disengaging with faith traditions and organized religion. And Bashir has really given us this data to kind of ground that. In some ways, we are beginning to disassociate. I want to know, and really open it up to the panel, what are the factors, do you believe, that are contributing to millennials leaving organized religion?
I'll jump in there. You could say, one thing you could say is that for some, there's a lack of trust with the institutions. And so for some, they don't see enough transparency. In some spaces, they don't feel that the conversations that they're looking to have are being presented there. So you're still having like some of the same baseline conversations, or there's no real level of depth of, let's talk sexuality, for instance. Okay, some places say, well, being gay is a sin. Well, why? And nobody can really get past the why other than point out a scripture. And then when people start asking more questions, that people get stumped, and then they'll just fall back on, well, the Bible says this, and end the conversation. And so when you don't have a level of depth in conversation, when you having the same conversations, then when people start asking questions about how the institution is run and nobody wants to open, to be honest about how institutions are run, then people will go find other spaces and places to where they can do that and have those conversations. So I think it goes back to that point of saying that people are not necessarily not people of faith or don't have faith. They just don't really rock with the institutions like that. And so really it's a matter of the institution shaping up versus the people shaping up in a sense.
I would agree with that too, and just qualifying what religion is today, right, as it is practiced, is what we see is that it comes up to blind dogma, blind rules, blind order, right? And with any institution, there is going to be a level of power that wants to be maintained. And in order to maintain power, you have to have organization, you have to have rules. And so I think that is what a lot of millennials are seeing today. And I don't think that's the same thing as saying, like you were saying, that there's no faith. You can have faith without an institution. And so right now, I think we see an imbalance between religion and spirituality, right? Either you're a spiritualist and you don't want order, or either you're a religious person who doesn't want spirituality. And so I think we're really living in an imbalance, and that millennials can recognize that and see that.
To piggyback, I think when you talk about power, you're also talking about gender, and you're also talking about race. And even in a lot of Black religious spaces, there are Eurocentric values that are lifted up and embodied and enacted amongst and upon Black bodies. And so one of the things that a lot of millennials are turned off by is this this incessant social climbing that happens in a lot of churches, by which you are able to, or by which one must establish themselves as being worthy of a blessing, worthy of a pulpit, worthy of an ordination. Whereas we also have this value of self-articulation, being able to self-define, right? And so a lot of people are giving up this power for spaces and communities in which we are able to articulate for ourselves who we are and what's important to us, and be able to find a tribe of people, maybe not a congregation of people, but a tribe of people who make us feel human and humanize us in ways that many ecclesial communities have failed to do.
Tiffany, I know you were.
Well, you know, we touched on so many things here, but for me, I identify as atheist now and a non-believer, but, you know, that took time. And so at first, you know, I went through the spiritual phase, but I did go to my church, you know, asking questions, and the tradition that I was accustomed to just wasn't working for me as I got older. I had unanswered questions, and also being gay, I was told that was a sin. I was going to hell, and to me, what deity, what father would punish me for being who I am? And that question wasn't answered in church. And so, you know, eventually I decided I chose logic over faith, or, you know, sight over faith. But the church, it wasn't changing with the times. And that's an issue. And if the church still wants to be around and beneficial, it's going to have to change.
Well, thank you so much. I'm grateful to be here, and I'm glad that my friend, the Reverend Dr. Brad Braxton, asked me to be a part of this conversation. I'm a little bit insulted that he listed me as the village elder. I didn't know I had arrived already. And I do feel a little, you know, strange being, it seems, stuck between the baby boomers on the one hand, large generation of folks who had an amazing impact on the culture positively and negatively, and the millennials. I'm Generation X, I guess somewhere in the middle. But I think that millennials' questions and challenges of the church are not unlike the ways in which they and many others in the culture are challenging institutions in general. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge that it's not just the church, that institutions themselves are being radically challenged and questioned in all kinds of ways, that there's a deep kind of hermeneutics of suspicion that gets applied to government, that gets applied to a whole range of institutions, and it would be foolhardy to think that the church, by some divine power, would escape that larger context of questioning that's happening in the culture in general. That said, I'm much encouraged by the kind of serious questioning and conversations and that's being put forth by millennials. I remember just a few years ago, in the wake of the events in Ferguson, you know, because I pastor Ebenezer Church, you know, I'm talking to folks in the civil rights generation all the time. And you all remember there was this big debate going on between the civil rights generation and the Black Lives Matter generation. And there were those who were saying, oh, these folks, they don't quite have it right. And they began to reimagine the civil rights movement as if it were some time when everybody knew exactly what to do. Everybody was in order. There was a clear agenda. You know, and no, you got to do it this way, do it that way. But if you study that movement, you know it was much messier than that. And I said, well, you know, I'm actually encouraged. I would be very discouraged if all of this could be going on and younger sisters and brothers were not in the streets. And so whatever excesses, challenges, what was most encouraging is that they were out there. Folks were out there challenging this and saying this will not stand. So as a pastor, I'm always evangelized and informed by the insights of millennials. They're challenging us in ways that I actually welcome. And I look forward to this ongoing conversation.
Awesome, thank you.
Can I say, I really appreciate you taking us to that point about institutions, Dr. Warnock. The thing that I think that we have to keep in mind around this conversation is that what separates the church from any other institution is the claims that the church makes about who it's supposed to be. And the claims that the church makes about the function that it desires or that it's supposed to have. And even if we think about the church as Jesus' idea, not Jesus' creation, the way that Jesus imagined and called for it to function. The claims separate the church from any other institution. And the church has an undeniable chasm between the claims and what it embodies. And that's the problem. That's the central problem, and it makes the church a hypocritical institution. And as an ethical institution, one that is supposed to be an ethical institution, the hypocrisy is really problematic.
I actually don't think the church or other religious institutions are the only one that makes claims. Our federal government makes the biggest claim of all, to protect all citizens. Black people are in prison, black people get shot every day, there's no protection, but yet your president and all presidents will go out there every day and tell you a lie. They're putting false claims. And so I don't think it's just the religious institution or the church specifically that you're referring to that is isolated in this claim.
It's the only, but I do think that the church makes unique claims.
The Black church is the pillar of the Black community. The government has always been shady, will always be shady.
Always.
But
Always.
yeah, our church, we're supposed to be able to turn to our congregations in our church. And we're not able to do that.
Yes.
So where are folks going?
And so that's a good question. I mean, I think that leads us into another question I have. I got so many questions, but y'all are going and I'm loving it. And so I'm just gonna let the conversation flow. But if millennials are and I really want to circle back because I know that there's some different things happening with millennial Muslims, right? So as Black Christians are declining, there's something else happening with Black Muslims. And so to ground that conversation, and the beauty of this conversation is that we infuse everyone's faith traditions and a myriad of faith traditions or beliefs or spiritual practices And so before moving forward, I really want to know, Bashir, right? Because as we said, Christians are leaving. Black millennial Christians are decreasing. What's happening with Black Muslims, right?
So it's interesting because you mentioned the fact that we see very different patterns by different religious groups, right? So the group that's probably seen the largest declines are the historically Black Protestant denominations. The millennials, as of 2014, it was the first time that we saw a group that wasn't predominantly identifying with that group. Only about 4 in 10 millennials were identifying with historically Black Protestant denominations. And if you look at any other generation, you saw much higher numbers identifying. And so that was a pretty big change. That was sort of a kind of a watershed that we'd reached this almost tipping point. And so the question becomes, well, where are they going, right? And a lot of them are disaffiliated, as we said. They're leaving organized religion. Even if they're maintaining faith, they're leaving organized religion. But we also see a large number converting to other faiths. In particular, Islam is the one that we see the largest number. Now, to be clear, if you look at Christianity as a whole, it's still the case that most Black millennials identify as Christian. That hasn't changed. The share has dropped, but it's still, the majority still identify as Christian. And the share that identify as Muslim remains relatively small. It's still in the single digits. But if you look at who's converting to Islam, African Americans are far and away the largest number. About half of all converts to Islam are African American. So we definitely see a draw to Islam. And I think there are a lot of reasons that for that draw that many of us know. You know, they go back to a historical historical claims to the religion, historical ties to the religion. They come back to Black Americans first coming to this continent. And so that has been there. And so there's been a space for Islam in the minds of the Black community that just isn't there for the white community. You know, for much of the white community, Islam kind of came on stage with 9/11. Whereas for the Black community, you know, we knew Malcolm.
Yeah.
We knew Muhammad Ali. We knew that they were Muslim. And so when many of us think of Islam, we think of those figures in our community now and in the past that were speaking to building the community, to how to improve yourself, how to do right by yourself and by your community, and that psychological space that's present within the Black community, I think, is a lot of why you see the high rates of conversion.
So if we have these high rates of conversion, right, we have Black millennials leaving Christendom, we have Black millennials embracing other labels, spiritual, not religious. We have Black millennials, as Tiffany explained, that are identifying as atheists. If we're leaving these spaces, where are we? If we're not going to these spaces, where are we going, right? And that's really the question, that Black millennials, when we are leaving organized spaces, are creating new spaces that have different types of conversations that may not can happen in Islam, that may not happen in Christianity, that may not happen in organized religion. And so I really want to pose to the panel, where are we going, right? Is brunch the new church? Is veganism the new church, right? Is Beyonce concert the new church, right? Or is it the new mosque? Like, where are we going if we're disaffiliating with these historic institutions that were, as to use Tiffany's point, right, once pillars of the community, right? So I really want to pose that. What's happening?
I can say for me, in leaving, you know, organized religion and, you know, just coming to be atheist, I still wanted to congregate. I still wanted to gather. I still wanted to be amongst like-minded people. I still wanted to feel love and embrace other people and share experiences. So I found a Black hiking group. I found a Black vegan meetup group. You know, I found a Black theater group, and so we go see different plays around Atlanta. We still want to come together, but you know, the church just isn't working for many people, but we're still out here and we're coming together. So we're just finding new spaces, and brunch is a part of it too. So
You could say even in digital space too. So I think about the variety of group meets I'm in. Shout out to the dive team. Shout out to my ISM group back home. Like when we talk about politics, we talk about religion, we talk about faith, we talk about everything under the sun. You could go to Black Twitter. Shout out to Black Twitter. You go to Trap Karaoke and just have a good time with the homies. Like it's wherever you go with like-minded people. And like-minded doesn't mean that you think the same thing, but you just like-minded in the sense of that we're willing just to have the conversation. We're willing to talk.
Yeah.
Me and my friends disagree all the time about everything, but it's about growing together. And even back to the simple things around the kitchen table, with your friends at somebody's house. Like it's not like this kind of we leave the church and go start this other church somewhere else, but it's really happening in the spaces that we find ourselves in every single day.
Yeah.
Can I just add real quick? The church doesn't own being able to gather. So we all can do that no matter what. So our Black non-believers, we gather together. We talk about politics. We talk about race issues. So the church doesn't own that. So it's okay for us to be leaving and seeking other spaces. I just wanted to throw that. That's how I feel.
Yeah, and I would say I have a digital space, right? I have a podcast, Identity Politics, that focuses on Muslims in America, and that is specifically tailored to young millennials. And we do create a digital community where people find solace. They find that it's a space where people are having conversations that they want to have, but maybe they can't find public spaces where these conversations are happening. At the same time, on the podcast, my co-host and I always tell people, hey, we are not religious scholars. Like, that's not what this space is for, because I think also what you'll see among millennials is an incredible high level of ignorance. And as a millennial, I can say that, where you'll see a lot of millennials on Twitter saying things they know nothing about. And people will claim to be experts on things that they have no knowledge of. And I think that's a really dangerous thing, especially if you are leaving religious institutions like a church or a mosque, and then you're going into another space that's filled with ignorance, right? So you're still holding these questions that now you have another group of people answering for you that have no knowledge. And so as a responsible person of a platform where I know people look to me like that, I have guests on my show who are experts in different areas of religious knowledge. And this is where we guide people to. So I'm never guiding people to myself, because that's not what I do. But I do create a space where people can find the answers to their questions. And so I think millennials can be just as irresponsible as the previous generation that we're claiming. So I just wanted to put that out there.
I also think for as many ignorant millennials, there's about 20,000 other intelligent ones. And thinking millennials. And so, like, I might be biased, but we might not go to church, but we come to chapel, right? Where on Sunday, we try to be in and out in 45 minutes because brunch awaits. And so do naps.
Chicken and waffles.
Await. But we, in this particular space and in so many other spaces, we stand on intellectual shoulders, Black intellectual shoulders, and we stand on them squarely, strongly, and proudly. Howard Thurman is one of my predecessors in Sisters Chapel. He wrote a book called With Head and Heart, which to me is my open invitation to be just as deep and spiritual and using those GRE words that I paid, and that I paid to learn, and bring it in here. And this is kind of in this way of saying you don't have to leave your brain at the door when you worship. You don't have to leave your critical thinking skills when you come into God's house, because if anyone needs to be thinking critically, it should be people of faith. And I do think that there's something to be said, though, about what we're trying to do here is trying not to be so political in here. And I don't mean like not prophetic, but what I mean is hierarchical. What I really want to do in this particular space is if you walk in here and you decide, I want to sing a song, even if it is a joyful noise, you can sing your song. Come and sing your song. And not having people feel like they have to be so qualified just to be in community. And then there's like the piece of, as a religious leader myself, what happens in my solitude is often my church. I was reading, anybody read Heart Talk by Cleo Wade? Anyways, I mean, I have wept over that book. I have cried reading Their Eyes Were Watching God. On many occasions, I have wept listening to Jill Scott. I have wept reading Audre Lorde. I mean, and so this idea of community is also really important, but I think we, as millennials, have also tapped into this discourse around self-care and healing ourselves and healing each other that is deeply spiritual work.
So I always laugh when people say that they are suspicious or opposed to organized religion. My response is, you should join a Baptist church. We're not that organized. You hang around a little while longer, you'll see. But seriously, I think it's important to remember that the church didn't show up with large steeples and stained glass windows. The earliest church, these were gatherings in houses. These were house churches. And so as I think about millennials gathering in coffee houses and in smaller spaces, I think there's power there. There's potential there. I'm encouraged by this deep hunger and interest in things spiritual and in spirituality. But I do think that with spirituality comes some form of accountability. And while the community may be burdened with whatever challenges or contradictions that it has, and I agree with my sister and colleague, Dr. Michelle Guidry, but there's a way in which the disconnect between our claims and our lives represents hypocrisy. There's a way in which it just represents the fact that we're human and broken, which is something that the church has always taught. And I think what millennials appreciate is when we're honest about that. I think all of us appreciate that. When we're honest and transparent about the fact that all of us are in some sense broken, that there is some disconnect. And you may have other ways of talking about that in your faith tradition or no faith tradition at all. I'm very interested in talking to black folk who are atheists, which tend to be minorities. There are not many black folk, not a whole lot. And I think there are reasons for that. I think that there are conversations that many of us are engaged in that we're able to have in some ways because of privilege that's been passed on to us because of the struggles of other people. You don't find many poor people generally who don't have some depth or grounding in something larger than themselves that gives them the ability to believe that they can fight against the tragic limits of history. But as I talk to atheists, I discover that the God that many of them reject, I reject that God also. If your God is a racist, sexist, homophobe, who doesn't recognize that all people reflect the image of God, then I'm with you. That's not my God either. So I think it's important for us to be able to have these conversations. I think these delineations between generations, I think it's helpful, but part of the beauty and power, I think, of the African worldview is that there's always been intergenerational conversation. And part of what does happen in traditional spaces, and if you got to find ways to recreate it, fine. I think if you got to find ways of turning those institutions upside down, I wait to see the ways in which millennials will change some of these old institutions even as they create their own. But we've always had intergenerational conversations in the African and African American community, and I think all of us had better the more we talk to one another.
So in that same vein, I want to pose this question, two questions, and one to you, Pastor Warnock. If we go back to these small worship spaces, doesn't that put you out of business, right? And not just you specifically, but our religious institutions, right? If we go back to brunch or these small gatherings of people, doesn't it threaten the institution and its existence towards the future?
I think institutions die when they get caught up with the obsession of self-preservation.
That's good.
I think that's the definition of death. You know, I preach tomorrow morning, not today, but if you seek to save your life, you will lose it. But if you give your life over to something, I mean, Jesus had some good stuff. You should try. If you give your life over to something larger than yourself, whether you are a person or an institution, you'll discover your life. The church became more than just a church during the heady days of the civil rights movement. And we can do that again. It won't look like that, and it doesn't need to look like that. But, you know, part of what has created the millennial generation, Black millennials, is that we are seeing the first generation of African-American adults who are the products of America's awful system called the New Jim Crow.
It's good.
These are the children of communities that have been decimated by the last 3 decades of a carceral state unlike anything ever witnessed in our history. And whether your father was warehoused or not, 2.5 million Americans in prison, 50% of them us, largely nonviolent drug-related offenses. Whether your parents were warehoused or not, our communities have been impacted by that. And I think it's created a theological problem and a question. Where was God?
Right.
Where was the church?
Yeah.
While all of this was happening? And where is our voice in the midst of this? And I think that millennials and people who are concerned about this and are focused on it are waiting to hear the voice of not only the church, but the mosque, the temple, all of our institutions speaking to these issues that actually matter. And when we give our lives over to that, we'll find our purpose, our meaning, and our place in a new moment.
I want to jump in right there. That self-preservation moment hit me because I think that's why, I don't even think. I know that's why a lot of churches want to engage millennials now, because they're trying to survive now. So when you think about my parents' generation who are now getting on fixed income, they don't have as much money as they had before. So they don't give as much as they give before. Now that 10% is dropped. So now you have millennials who are coming of age, many of us starting families and now starting young families. You're getting into your job, and now we're the ones that have the income now. And so we want to reach millennials now because you have the young families now. We also have student loan debt. Talk about it.
You got a lot of it. You got a lot
I have 100,000 myself. I keep it all the way 100.
Fat.
A lot of it.
Sally Mae gets my 10%.
Right.
And so when I think about, so when you couple that also with knowing about the sociological things that are happening now, when you talk about mass incarceration, all these other things, now the question becomes, do you genuinely care about these things as an institution, or is it now the popular thing to talk about? Because I know if I say this, millennials will hear that and they'll come in because they think I'm about justice. But when the wave runs, when the wave hits the shore and crashes out, when mass incarceration is not the new topic, but now we go to the next thing and we forget about the people that are in prison. Mental health is a new conversation now when the mental health wave dies down. What's the next conversation? And so the real question now becomes, with our institutions, is this really you? When you want to talk about, when we talk about that poor Palestinian, but we have these huge churches that have huge mortgages that have to be paid, and if they're not paid, they get closed, and when they get closed, developers are going to eat that land up. And everybody's out of commission at that point. So now there are layers to this. What Meek said, that there are levels. There are levels.
Look.
And so now it's really about, back to this now thing about transparent, like who are you? Like really to the heart of it, who are you? Do you really believe in that Palestinian Jew who was poor? He was not rich, he ain't have no home. Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And so that's, I don't hear that gospel preached often. Because that don't get people to come in the doors. People want a blessing because they broke. They sow the seed because they looking for something to return because they broke. And so we gotta ask the gospel, what gospel are we really preaching? Because the thing about it, millennials getting old, and when we done with millennials, we're gonna talk about Generation Z. When Generation, it's all in waves. And so now it goes back to the real question, who are you? And when you're able to answer that and stick to your laws and stick to who you are. No matter if a bunch of people come in the door, nobody's coming in the door. If you can stay true to who you are, God believe God will bless that.
Yes.
That's interesting because I feel like that question can also be flipped back on the parishioner, right? Like you don't just see this happen in religious institutions, but we see this in our society in general. So your church can operate in waves because we operate in waves. We care about the Palestinian the one day, now we're on to the next thing the next day, now we on to this, now we on to Kanye, now we on to this, and we don't remember. We don't remember. We don't remember the things that happen. That's why we can jump from one war to the next, right? And so you have to also think, yeah, if I'm a religious leader, I'm gonna sucker the hell out of these people because they're not gonna remember what happened last week, last month, last year. So how much do you really care? Who are you?
And I think that goes to the responsibility of the quote unquote leader. I still read my Bible a little bit, even though I haven't worked in the church in a year. Book of James says you shouldn't, in so many words, don't really wish to be a teacher because there's gonna be more judgment on you than anybody else.
Yes.
And so the thing about being a leader is that more often than not, people who are parishioners, they're gonna trust what their pastor says more often than not. So if the pastor is pointing them in a certain direction and saying, hey, this is what we're gonna be focused on. During my time at Ebenezer, we said we're gonna be focused on mass incarceration and this is what we're gonna stick to. We're not going to necessarily try to dig in everything else, but guess what? We don't have the capacity to dig in everything else. Right. So a lot of times it's knowing about your capacity as a leader and what your institution can and can't do. And that's where it opens up the door for collaboration because your church could do this, your church could do that, this space could do this space, but it all goes back to the big question of who are you?
Yes.
And so if you have leaders who don't know who they are, what you think the parishioners are going to be?
They're going to be idiots.
So,
like, I'm not following anybody who doesn't know who they are. And if you do, it's a harsh reality, but you are an idiot. You're allowing yourself to be led.
I didn't go to Harvard.
Yeah.
I didn't go to Harvard.
One at a time.
But am I hearing that the indoctrinated parishioner should be at fault for tithing? And that pastor having a jet, that's the parishioner's fault?
No, I'm not saying necessarily for tithing. I'm saying if you are part of an institution where you can't understand the meaning behind why your religious leader is doing something, if you haven't asked the question, why are we doing this? What are we doing this?
Is questioning promoted?
Where's the self-accountability?
But I think,
Where's the self-accountability?
But that's the trickiness of religion. But I think that's the trickiness of religion altogether because, so funny story, right? So, during my time at Ebenezer, I had the opportunity to teach the midday Bible study class. That was usually with our senior members. They were usually all 60 and up. I shouldn't say, yeah, whatever. So, yeah, says language is tricky, but we had great conversations in there. I remember one gentleman in particular, probably about 70. And we deep dive in a lot of those conversations. I remember him coming back to me, he was like, I didn't know that I could really ask questions. Because grandma used to always say, don't question God.
Right.
That trickles down to typically the person who is the leader, typically a man, you don't question the man of God.
Yeah.
So these are traditions that are passed down that fortunately we're a generation who was bumping up against that. And so I think that's the thing about it where it's like, it's difficult to rail up against a generation to call them idiots because that is kind of harsh. Because there's still a larger context into that generation was why they did what they did.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of times it's difficult to drop names without context.
And so with that, now that's the thing where it's like that power. That goes back to that power piece
right.
where you have it really tripped me out when I realized that people who are old enough to be my great grandmother trusted me all because I had Reverend in front of my name.
Right.
That
right.
blows my mind, and I
Right.
recognize I have a great responsibility with that.
That's
so
right.
I can't just say anything because guess what? There is going to be that person that's going to hang on my word just because I'm a reverend, because they trust and respect that office. So when people have your respect, you have a duty to them not to just say any and everything because you have the power. That's irresponsibility, and guess what? God don't like that.
Oh yeah, and I should say, when I say that, I'm not saying that I don't understand the context behind that or why that is, but there is a gross ignorance when you don't take it upon yourself to find the answers, right? And I'm not talking about like 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, but when you're 30 and can't understand why this percentage of your money is going towards this institution and you don't know why you're doing it and where it's going. It's like when you go to the grocery store and they're like, do you want to donate to a cancer child today? And I'm like, actually, no, because I don't know what you're going to do with this money. And so, I mean, I just mean that, like, right? Like, as an adult, right, you can pick up a book. You can ask questions. You can go search and seek the answers that you're desiring.
Which book? The Bible?
I didn't say the Bible.
Yeah, which book?
I'm not saying the Bible. I'm saying that we have a library of books that have the answers that you're looking for. There are people that have the answers that you're looking for, right? God didn't put you on this earth without the answer.
And I think that, and what you're saying, and there, you definitely have a point to what you're saying. It's definitely one of those things to where, one thing I credit seminary with was giving me the tools to be able to critically engage my faith. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't have access to that information. Now, granted, you're right. We got Google, we got all these other things.
No, I'm saying you even have your auntie and your uncle. Black people are the most suspicious people.
But what I'm saying,
on this planet.
what I'm saying is though, Pitt's Theological Library not gonna let everybody in their library over on Emory's campus.
Yes.
A lot of people not gonna get a Woodruff Library that's on this campus. A lot of people got a lot of stuff going on and where they don't really care about things about that. I'm just trying to pay my bill today. I don't really care about that right now. And so it's
And I also think that we have to be very honest about the cultures around the protection, the preservation of not only of identity, but also of power, right? And to preserve power, it means that for those who do have the guts, the gall to ask those questions, there's always going to be a punishment for that. There's always going to be a punishment for those who decide I'm going to ask a question that's not in my place to ask. And so this is why this question will always, in Michael's words, it'll always be a question about who are the leaders? Are you creating a culture in which people are safe to ask questions? Are you creating a culture in which people are afraid to because they don't want to be ousted out the church?
No, I mean, okay, so say
it depends on where you are.
It depends on where you are and who's leading the place where you are.
There is a culture of dogmatism that lives in many of our churches. But I think black people had to learn how to be fundamentalists. It doesn't really come naturally. That's something we adopted. There's a long tradition of critical questioning by grandma who didn't even go to seminary. You know, Howard Thurman's grandmother told him, read the Bible to me, but don't read Paul.
Don't read Paul.
Because, you know, the master used to read that to me, and I always read the same passage out of Ephesians. Slaves obey your masters. Our folk didn't have any seminary training, but somehow they stumbled into Exodus where God told Moses to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. They recognized that there was something else in here. Dr. King, at age 12, in Ebenezer Sunday School, with his dad as the pastor, said he didn't believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. He was asking hard, critical questions early on. So there are traditions of questioning that go on. I think part of what I would like to hear a little bit more about, and it's a question, it's one thing to ask, well, how do we find spaces of spirituality? Part of what community does for us also is it creates spaces of accountability. And those spaces are not perfect, but there are, when I'm off and by myself, I can convince myself of a whole range of things. But part of what a community does for me that has a history, that has sacred texts, And sacred doesn't mean infallible. That's somebody else's stuff. That's not our stuff. Part of what it means to have a community with sacred texts, with tradition, with a history, is that I'm part of a conversation that has been going on. It didn't just start when I showed up. So what are those spaces of accountability for millennials in this moment? Is part of what I would like to hear more about.
So for the sake of our time, and we need to get to our questions, I know time goes by very fast, we have to get to our audience questions. So I will keep that question in the forefront of your mind. Our audience members did submit questions, so I want to pose some of them to you. I will start with this question that I had already prepared because I think it's important to ground ourselves. We are at a women's college,
Yes.
right? And so we haven't talked about women's issues, right? And Black women's issues in particular. So I think we have to ground ourselves. And the question, we've danced around it some, but I really want to put this question on the table and then also pose about 2 questions from our panelists. This question in particular is, historically, Black women have girded up Black institutions, educational, social, and religious, both financially and physically. Have Black religious spaces done a good job in caring for Black women?
Next question.
No.
So we got some responses from the audience.
I'm hearing it's been answered. Next question.
They're like, next.
But in light of where we're going, I want to allow the Black women on the panel to answer that question. And then also, I'm going to pose these next 2 questions. So before you jump in, I'm going to pose them all, and then we kind of do a rapid fire. Another question that came from Carl from Sandy Springs, Georgia, is the millennial group heading to a more agnostic version of Christianity or other religions? If so, where will this movement lead the culture and the society? That's one question. This is another question. The name was not put on it. This person says, faith requires logic. Romans 12:2 says, be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. How do you address the fact that the truth that God absolutely wants us to be logical, thoughtful, and spiritual? How do you kind of address that issue? So I'm going to leave us with those 3. I want to kind of put those out there, and then also having Pastor Warnock's question on the table, which I think is actually a great way to end the conversation, talking about accountability. So.
I think the short answer is no, right? I think we heard that from the audience. And I guess to illustrate, and I don't want to be extremist here, to illustrate, I want to lift up the homegoing of Aretha Franklin. Not a shining moment, right? In the history of the Black church in the United States. In fact, a very dark moment. My dissertation was on rape culture in the Black church, utilizing womanist theology and womanist methodologies for subverting rape culture in the pulpit. I thought as I watched the homegoing that it was a microcosm of the problem at large. When you watched visually, there weren't a lot of women in the pulpit. There were women singing. There might have been women in the audience, but that dais, that pantheon of clergy, were male-bodied. I might be wrong, but I think there might have been 1 or 2 women up there, not known feminists, not known womanists. And so what we saw there was the prescription of roles and the assignment of power. And the way that these things fall along the gender line, right? But then something else happened, where the young lady, Ariana Grande, was singing at the request of Aretha Franklin. And after her song, not only was she bashed for her ethnicity, but she was groped by a clergyman, right? For a sustained period of time. And people watched, you know? And she's visibly uncomfortable. And the discourse thereafter is not, she didn't deserve that, this shouldn't have happened, but well, if she wasn't wearing what she was wearing, then it wouldn't have happened in the first place. And it just goes on and on from there, right? And so we have this, again, this microcosm of rape culture, right? You have all the elements. You have the subordination of women. You have the upliftment and the prioritization, the normalization of maleness. You have victim blaming. You have all of these different elements. I use that as an example because that wasn't even a year ago. And that was in the throes of the Me Too movement when the church should have been reflectively thinking about what's our role in this society. And it was the women's work to call that out. I was wondering where the brothers at, you know? Where's the outcry among the brothers? And so I use that as an example because whether it happened on a national, international stage, at the funeral of a woman, or it happened in the secrecy of, you know, nobody's little black church on somebody's corner. So many of us have had that experience. And the expectation has been that not only were we expected to maintain silence, but we were also expected to just keep on working, keep on singing, keep on teaching, keep on standing in the front of the podium to preach your little, to say your little message. You know, and so there's all these different ways that the church has benefited and profited off the bodies and the labors and the gifts of black women, but have not offered black women sanctuary. That being said, as a daughter of the black church, I do think that the church has offered some of us soft places to land. And this is me stretching, trying to find some grace in the situation, right? But I have to be mindful of the fact that there were some church mothers, in my experience. There were some ushers that, you know, would guide me to the safe section of the sanctuary. And even like, you know, my own mother recognizing, you know, my daughter's not necessarily safe in this space. I don't want her going there. You know, and so I think we have a resounding no, but I think that some of us in this room might be able to offer some insight or some story that is maybe somewhat redemptive. Because there were black church women who toiled some soils that we're now standing on. Especially as those of us who identify as faith leaders as women. Where would we be without the black church women who you know, who did the formative work? So I want to offer that as a caveat.
So we have about 5 minutes. I want to allow you to.
Sorry. Y'all, hey.
No, it was good.
This is my life's work. I'm passionate about this.
Hey,
I wanted you to get it.
This is her pulpit.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Rev.
Absolutely. So I wanted to, I want to make sure that we can get to some of the other things. So really 5 minutes. So if you want to respond to any other 3 questions that were at the table. But thank you so much, Nichelle.
If I can, I just want to quickly respond about the question about faith and logic, because I feel like people are like, oh man, you called us idiots. But I think when you look at the prophetic example of any of our prophets, right? Jesus, if you look within the Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, it was all about teaching. Like prophets came to teach, and they would develop circles where they brought people in who invited, and they would teach them, right? They weren't just saying, okay, cool, do X, Y, and Z. They were teaching, and they opened up the space for questioning. And I'm just thinking about our ancestors, right, who were enslaved, right? A lot of them didn't know how to read the English words, but they were like, you know what? I'm ready for whatever punishment that is going to come my way. Like, I might get so-and-so many lashes, but I'm going to get this Bible down because I need to know some English. I need to know how to escape this situation. And so I think sometimes we're a little afraid to step out there or to maybe read text that we don't know, to sit with people we don't know, but we come from a tradition, a long tradition of people that are willing to take whatever risk to ensure their liberation. And so when I'm talking about knowledge, not just okay, let me know what this passage says and what this passage says. I'm talking about knowledge for the purpose of liberation, liberating your mind, liberating your body. And so that's what I mean. When you don't do that, you are always going to be someone's sucker. Someone's always going to be telling you from what they know and not what you know. And I think that self-determination is so critical, especially for Black people.
Any other?
I think Dr. Guidry, really summed it up, but I just wanted to add that I think as millennials, as we continue to challenge the scripture, the church, things that have been indoctrinated in our culture, I think you will see a rise in agnosticism or people who just identify as there's something out there. You know, I don't think we just came to be out of nothing, but they are going to abandon this traditional institution that we grew up with. And it's going to happen as we learn more, as we want, the more that we want to be intersectional. I don't think you can have intersectionality right now with the state that the church is in currently. So I think you will see a rise in agnosticism.
I guess I got
Final comment.
two quick things. One, on behalf of Black men, we need to do better. We can do better. And we will do better. I can definitely say, and this actually ties into the accountability piece. I want to say, I see by the homie Josh. What up, Josh? Within our, I'm gonna speak specifically within our friend group. We do a very good job of making sure that we hold each other accountable about how we treat women, how we talk about women,
Yeah.
how we talk about other communities. Like, we had some friends that really like using the F word, and I'm not talking about F-U-C-K.
Right.
When it comes to LGBTQ, I'm learning. And we're like, anytime we heard them say something, it was an immediate check, like, no, don't say that. We don't say that around here. And so knowing that we have friends that we're not gonna tolerate how we may have been brought up a certain way, there's no excuse to still be better and do better. And so when we think about those accountability spaces, it happens in those group meetings because we have a group meet together. Think about it like small groups.
Yeah. Yep.
That's another way.
Yep.
So everybody has like their small groups, and those small groups are there because that's how people hold each other accountable.
Right.
So when you think about our group meetings, your different text threads that you have with your friends and your family, even whatever that thing is for you, whether it's your hiking group, whether it's your yoga group, your vegan group, your cooking group, within that, there's still a deeper level of relationship that when you see something, you say something.
Yes.
If you see good things, you celebrate those good things. If you see things where people can improve and be better, you're like, wait a minute, you could be better right here. You could grow right here. And that's where the accountability is happening. So it doesn't, that's where the accountability is happening. I'll stop right there.
Can we give our panelists a round of applause?
Thank you.
When we return from a brief break, we will go right into our second panel, Faith and Community. And I promise you we have another dynamic group of people to come up and to engage. So we will be right back after a brief break. We're going to turn it over to DJ Hourglass. Thanks so much.
Welcome to God Talk Atlanta. This is a discussion on millennials and faith. So up first, we have our first guest. Let us know your name and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Mandisa, and I am the founder and president of Black Nonbelievers, which is based here in Atlanta.
Okay. So tell me about your first introduction of faith. What was that like?
Well, I wasn't formally raised religious. I was raised secular in a non-religious household, but I am a classically trained singer, and I used to sing in different churches growing up under a voice instructor, and my grandmother was very religious, so I would attend church services with her from time to time.
So in your own words, what is faith? What does that mean to you?
Well, according to the definition of faith, it is things hoped for and things that are unseen. And so as an atheist, I do not live my life by faith, but I certainly understand that there are those who do.
And what are your thoughts on people who do practice faith?
I tend to look at everyone and their actions and what they do. There are a lot of people who I know that are believers and who live their lives by faith that are just good people. And so I would hope that those very same people would look at me as a non-believer the same way, that we are not just judged as having no morals and not being good people at all. So hopefully that stigma is broken within the community.
Right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have another guest with us this evening to talk religion and faith. First of all, let us know your name and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Kim Daly, and I'm from Houston, Texas.
Okay. So in your own words, how would you define faith?
I define faith as the belief system, the way that I choose to live my life and what that's based and rooted in.
Okay. And personally, what is your faith?
So I am a member of an online faith community known as the Unfit Christian Congregation. My faith is more fluid now than it was when I was growing up. So I grew up in the Baptist church under a strict set of rules of what faith had to be for me. And now that I'm growing out of that, I get to define faith for myself. So at this point in my life, faith looks like loving others, right? Doing good, actively doing no harm, and seeking to bring the love of God that I feel into the lives of people that I interact with.
Awesome. So when you grew up, what was the faith that you were first introduced to?
Lord. Okay, so I grew up in the Black Baptist church. And so it was a very expressive faith. It was an outward, when you're grateful, you praise God. When things are not good, you praise God. Through everything, you praise God. You do not question God. That was very big. And then there was a lot of pressure and a lot of encouragement, I would guess, to express my faith by what I did do, and more often than not, by what I didn't do.
Okay. And when did you decide that you wanted to change your faith and you decided that this new faith was for you?
My faith began to evolve in 2017. So I've been a lesbian since I've been old enough to know what a lesbian is, but growing up in the Baptist faith tradition, you don't do that, right? You pray about that. You ask for the power of God to keep you on the straight and narrow. And I finally took the time to think about that for myself, and I realized that it didn't make sense to live that dichotomous life between what I was raised to believe and what I knew to be true for myself. And so that transition came 2 years ago at the age of 27.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have one more guest here to talk about faith. Let us know your name and where you're from.
Yes, my name is Chad Nails, and I'm from South Orange, New Jersey.
Okay. In your own definition, what does faith mean to you?
Faith is everything that you hold on to beyond what you experience in, in your 5 sense life. It's that hunch that you get. It's that dream that stirs you to move something. So for me, faith is just a combination of everything that you get from outside of yourself, and that everything outside of yourself really has to be God. And as long as you take it in and you move with it sincerely, then you have it.
And what is your own faith? What is your denomination?
My own faith is that I was raised in the Baptist church, very strict, very regimented, and ironically, that also led to, as far as them talking about there being a measure of freedom, I didn't feel a lot of freedom in it until I began to expand on what I believed faith was for myself.
And how does faith play a role in your everyday life?
Can't wake up without it. Can't wake up without it. It's part of what I use in my daily comings and goings as a life coach. So I'm touching on subjects like spirituality and subjects like how to strike that balance between the everyday and still being spiritual and still needing to do something. I help to unify that for people. So I use it pretty actively.
Has your faith changed any since you were growing up, or are you still that same strict Baptist?
Not at all. Ironically, it was me going to seminary and getting my license as a minister that started the process of me looking at faith as a whole. Because being in school, I was learning a lot of things that 20 years of being in church I had never touched. So then I started thinking, well, if this is happening in Christian faith, what's happening in the other faiths? So for a good 10, 11 years, I just went and immersed myself in everything, and now my faith is just like all over the place. But at the same time, I couldn't ask for it to be anything else.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you.
welcome back to God Talk. How many of you are enjoying the conversation? This is an amazing conversation, and I am excited about this second panel. Just want to continue to remind you to keep the conversation going even after tonight ends. Follow the hashtag GodTalk, the hashtag Black Faith, and also follow the museum on all of your social media platforms. Let's jump right into our second panel, Faith in Community. I want to start off by introducing our first panelist, Krystal Lee. Krystal is the co-host of the nationally syndicated Christian radio show, The Willie Moore Jr. Show. She graduated with a BA in Mass Media Arts from Clark Atlanta University. She is also the CEO and founder of Girls Plus God and Girls Plus Goals, a Christian-based apparel line. Please welcome Krystal Lee. Our next panelist, Park Cannon, is the Democratic State Representative for Georgia House District 58. She holds the distinction of being the youngest member of the Georgia House of Representatives. She is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a BA in Hispanic Linguistics and a minor in Women's and Gender Studies. Please welcome Park Cannon. Our next panelist is Tef Poe. Tef is an American rapper, musician, and activist from the St. Louis, Missouri area. Tef has advocated for the grassroots involvement of improving the lives of African Americans and racial justice within and outside of the United States. He is one of the co-founders of Hands Up United movement and currently serves as a fellow at Harvard University. Please welcome Tef Poe. Our next panelist is Danyelle "Dani" Canada, is a journalist, editor, and blogger with a specialty in entertainment news. She is the former assistant editor of hiphopwire.com and currently serves as the deputy editor of OneDigitalBossips.com. She currently pens snarky entertainment posts with witty headlines and provides commentary on Bossip on WeTV, airing on WeTV. Please welcome Danyelle "Dani" Canada. Our next panelist, Timil Jones, is an entrepreneur, real estate investor, and storyteller whose work is positioned at the intersection of wealth and wellness. Dubbed the Oracle of Atlanta as a nod to her real estate expertise and penchant towards the metaphysical, Timil facilitates ways for women to thrive financially and spiritually. Her writing and wellness work through the tarot is personally reflective, spiritually focused, and reframes existing narratives of motherhood and Black womanhood. Please welcome Timil Jones. Our next panelist is Danielle Thomas. Danielle is a catalyst for building community for transformative justice, wherein her call to aid others in the deconstruction of harmful ideas and systems that limit the empowerment and development of the African American community and their way forward through her progressive platform, The Unfit Christian. Danyelle holds a Bachelor of Arts in African American Studies and obtained an advanced degree in social policy. Please welcome Danielle Thomas. Also like to introduce our final panelist for the evening, DJ Hourglass. She serves as a DJ and event producer with her work crew based in Atlanta, a graduate of Washington University in St. Louis, and identifies as queer and an active Christian. She's also a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Please give a round of applause for our final panelist, DJ Hourglass. All right, so let's jump right into the conversation. I am excited about this conversation and where this conversation will lead. So my first question that I really want to pose, and I'm going to open it for everyone here, so jump right in. At what point in your life's journey did you become aware of your spiritual identity or have a spiritual awakening? And do you wish that that spiritual consciousness had developed sooner or later in your life? Not all at once.
I'll go. Yeah. I would say it didn't happen until much later. I was baptized into the church when I was 10 years old, and so that was a very powerful moment for me, but I wouldn't necessarily identify that as a spiritual moment or a moment where I was awakened in any way. It felt like a milestone. It felt like the next logical step in, my tradition, but it didn't feel super spiritual. I wouldn't identify a spiritual moment until much later, maybe around 2 years ago, at what I consider to be something what a lot of theologians and spiritual teachers call the dark night of the soul, where I was really in a deep depression and cried out to Spirit, somebody please help me, save me. And in that moment, I really felt God reawakening inside of me. And it was in one of the darkest moments of my life.
I mean, I would agree with that. I would say I was awoken to spirituality literally as a child when my father would wake me up to take me to church. I had no choice, I had to go. But I think it wasn't until I got much older when I really understood faith and what it meant to me. I think maybe it wasn't until college is when I really figured out like who I was and how religion played into that. I think before that, like she said, like maybe you got baptized, but it was, you kind of went with the motions because that was what was expected of you, was you get up, you go to church, you serve on the usher board, you do this as planned, but I don't know that it necessarily connected with me till I was grown.
I think I can agree with that. I grew up in church like a lot of us, and I was made to go to church. And for a lot of my life, I was kicking and screaming against anything, too deep. So in my walk in entertainment, and a lot of us up here are in the entertainment business, I kept trying to do my own thing. I'm going to do everything furthest away from God that I can do. So if that's TMZ, if that's hip hop radio, I'm going to do it. And God just kept saying like, no. You're going to keep coming back to me. And I think that, as she also said, traumatic times bring about, really, really leaning on God. And that is when I would probably say a few years ago, I had to say, I'm going to just be obedient. Like, I'm going to stop fighting. I'm going to just be obedient.
I'd agree. 4 years ago, I decided to run for office. I was 23, about 6 months out of college, and completely broke. I didn't have a network that could help me fundraise for my campaign, but what I did have was a church family. I attend Ebenezer Baptist Church and am proud to be third generation there. And as I started to see out my faith in that church, I knew that there were so many other churches in the district I was looking to serve. And so it's not enough to say I'm a member at a church and not show up to any other churches. So I had to go to other churches. And as I was doing that, I would be received differently. They had heard about me running as queer. They had heard about me speaking up about the different experiences I had in Atlanta. And so the awakening came for me in understanding, regardless of the setting or institution that I was in, which the first panel spoke about a little bit, that there's a mercy and a glory and an everlasting presence of God that I wanted to be a part of, and that wanted me a part of it. And so regardless of people's perceptions of me, I was to be in that place. And so that awakening is still resting over me right now.
For me, I was raised in the church. My father was a dude from the streets, sold dope most of his life. And I was about 3 or 4 years old. My mother evacuated our apartment because he was in the bathroom about to kill himself. And she took me and my siblings out the house. We went next door to the neighbors. And she told my father that if he didn't get his life together, she was going to leave him. So for most street dudes, getting your life together don't mean go to therapy. It means go to church. So he started going to church, and he just became like a very stringent religious zealot. So we grew up indoctrinated with the church, praying over us every night, bless all, couldn't listen to secular music in the crib. And then I discovered hip hop. And for me, that became a whole nother type of spiritual awakening. So I could answer that question like 4 or 5 different times. Like there's times where I thought I was a straight up Jesus fanatic. There's times where I've believed that I was atheist personally. There's times where, and I'm an ordained minister. And so there's different things in my life that have led me to different points. This summer, I was wrestling with a lot of things. I'm an entrepreneur. A couple of my businesses weren't doing what they should have been doing. And I found Islam. I started going to the mosque with one of the brothers I saw at the liquor store, and just going to Juma every Friday, like reintroduced me to God in a way that I didn't know that I could be reintroduced to God, in a way that I could learn things, in a way that gave me discipline, in a way that even caused me to like respect basic things that I never even considered respecting. So I think I could answer that question so many different ways. Even when I went to Harvard, being from the hood, and when I got out the car, the first thing I saw there was a sign that says, "What does God have for you at Harvard?" So I could consider all these different moments, spiritual moments that caused me to go to another level with my relationship with God.
For me, my spiritual awakening, if I could call it that, because I feel like the process of spiritual awakening is not one defining point. It is something that is constantly evolving, particularly when you decide to answer the question of who am I? Who is God to me and who is God for me? And so if you're constantly, as I do, using that as your base, it's a constant state of evolution in a spiritual awakening. But the defining, if I had to pick one for me, would be college. I grew up churched. My father was a Baptist minister. My mother, Church of God in Christ. So very deeply Black churched. And I got to college and started to realize the God that I thought I knew was incompatible with the language and the knowledge and the newness of the secular world that was being introduced to me through my education. And so as I continued to learn, there became this tension. And I came to a point where I said, you're either going to leave God behind or you're going to find a way to reimagine God that fits and situates in your new knowledge of self, your new knowledge of the world, and really define what a new idea of what God can be. So that is, I think, not only my defining moment, but it's also what undergirds the work that I do. Just asking those continuous questions. Who is God to me? Who is God for me? Because what I knew of God from that traditional church experience is not who God is for me now. And I had to leave that version, that idealization of God behind in order to really embrace the spiritual awakening, for lack of a better phrasing.
I believe that my spiritual awakening is still ongoing. I agree with Tef. I've had a lot of smaller moments that have been, they were big at the time, but they've led to me realizing who I am and where I am on my journey. My father is a drug addict, and I didn't learn that until I was about 13 or 14. And I was raised to go to church, sing in every service. We moved around a lot, so wherever we went to church and stayed, that was really our home. So seeing my father kind of rebel against what he had raised me to be kind of made me wonder, is going to church in this routine healthy as a routine, but is this really what I believe? And that's something that I know is still ongoing for me. I've definitely have moments where I'm always trying to seek out knowledge and experiences of other people, whether that's listening to a podcast, going to church, watching sermons, learning from people of other religions. I'm just starting to lean more into the fact that I feel like God for me is love and moving with love in everything that I do.
This program is called God Talk, right, with a little G. How do you define God? The divine, the sacred, or the ancestors? And are these images and sensory or artistic experiences that illustrate your definitions and depictions? Are there sensory or artistic experiences that illustrate your definitions or understandings or depictions of God, right? Because we hear the language of God, 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 but what do you mean by that?
For me, I would say really what was part of my spiritual awakening was redefining that image of God and heralding the feminine as divine, which is something that I did not get in church. In my particular church tradition, which is the Church of Christ, not only, and this happens in all Christian traditions where women aren't given as much power as a man. So I don't want to just, poo-poo on the Church of Christ, but it was literally women be silent. And there were even as much as having like a first lady. There were not even any real important roles for women in my church. So one thing that I've seen persist in the work that I do even with the tarot is that women's confidence levels are so low because I don't believe we're ever told how sacred that we are. And so part of my transformation was to realize that, hey, the Holy Spirit is a feminine entity for me. God is a woman. God can be feminine. Mothers are goddesses, and just really embracing different terms and looking to, for instance, African spirituality and Ifa, and to see different Orishas that are women, and these divine entities have feminine energy. And that was a big transformation for me, because I never, not only was God really a white man, or Jesus was, white, brown person, but mostly talked about as a man. To be able to change that was really, really transformational for me.
And I'm glad you said that. Somebody got to help me, because what is the name of this movie? And Octavia Spencer she was God when he needed the Shack. Thank you. So basically in that movie, everybody was going crazy. Like, why would you have God be a woman? And all this stuff was happening. And it's like, God is everything that you need when you need it.
Right.
So for me, that changes every day, every second.
Right.
Because I can be as deep as I want to be on the radio, but when my car got stolen last month, I was like, God, I don't even know right now. And so it's like every single second that needs to be redefined for me, because I might need more of a comforter. I might need more of a father. And so I think that it's ever changing for me.
Yes, yes. I mean, God shows up in so many different ways. I've been looking a lot into why I continue to see numbers repeated as times. Like, I'll look up at the clock, it's 222, it's 11:11, it's 9:11. I'm always seeing these same numbers. And so I've started to look into that a bit more. Is this God showing up for me right now? Is it time for me to pray right now? I'm not in a Muslim faith where I have those times where I pray consistently every day. So is this showing up for me? And this question brings up for me one of Atlanta's own, Killer Mike. He has a show right now on, it's called Trigger Warning. And on one of the episodes, he creates a religion. And it's controversial every episode, but ultimately this gets to the point of him saying that we have been idling and worshiping someone who is not our skin tone. And how is that impacting us? If we continue to see that, do we recreate who God is and what God looks like? And so he goes on through the series to actually create a God who is African American, who is Black, who is not necessarily, he doesn't speak much, he doesn't have strong opinions, he's more of a listener. He shows up in different spaces, he's willing to enter strip clubs and different places. He'll come with you and just accompany you. And in actually seeing that happen on TV, I think more of us would benefit from some of that, because we would get to see God in different spaces of our day, not just on Sundays when we're at church.
Well, part of my fundamental beliefs, I'm a little bit of everything. So y'all gonna learn that. I'm like, this dude got some crazy opinions. But I'm a little bit of everything. So, because I just believe that that's how life works. There's no definite answer to anything. It's no, like, we can't concretely say how the universe was formulated. Like, you can give me a theory about it, but most of these things that even the brightest minds in the world, when they give it to you, the word theory is still attached to it. So that means it's not a fact. So for me, I can't create like a and or if. I just have to function in a space of what makes sense to my life, what makes sense to me being a better man for my family, what makes sense for me being able to contribute to society in a productive way. And also, like, if I'm a Black man navigating through a racist world, and I happen to be very opinionated publicly about that. So if I go to jail, I need coverage from some brothers. You feel me? So if I find myself in the pen, I have a nestle of brothers that I know, hey, you're gonna flow right in with us. But whether they be Crips, whether they be Bloods, whether they be Muslims. So I find God in those spaces of camaraderie, those spaces of unity. I do believe that God, the actual spiritual energy of God is a feminine energy. I do believe that. I do believe that the Black woman is a manifestation of God, the highest manifestation of God on this planet, in my personal opinion. But, and in both the Bible and the Quran, you find support for that. You find quotes in the Quran that says Allah has a womb. They conveniently don't say that when they talk about it publicly, though. So for me, God is wherever you at in a time where you are uncertain about some things and it ain't all good. And sometimes it is all good. Sometimes you wake up and say, man, my life ain't that bad. It's people eating bombs for breakfast this morning. God gonna look totally different to them than it does to me waking up in a condo in downtown across the street from the St. Louis Arch.
So, in defining God, I want to know what role, as all of you are in your various spaces in the community, right, and out in the community in your various vocational callings, what role does faith and spirituality play in your activism and your artistic work? And how are they able to sustain faith and spirituality? How are you able to sustain faith and spirituality in the face of injustice?
For me, they are absolutely intertwined. And part of my work is finding those spaces where we can affirm our call to justice, our call to do the work to bring justice for each and every person who is in a marginalized body. So absolutely faith undergirds my activism because I do believe that God called me to do justice. God called me to walk humbly. God called me to... These are things straight out the text. I can look directly in the text and know that I am called to do these things. So there is no separation there for me. And I have to help people who have only seen an image of God as a punisher, an image of God as this masculine energy that is here to oppress those who are female-bodied. I have to do, and so this is all talk about activism. So now we're talking about dismantling sexism. We're talking about dismantling homophobia. We're talking about dismantling all of these isms and schisms that do not help us to a place of grace, a place of justice, a place where we all feel whole. We have such a heavy focus in our churches, our traditional religious spaces, on being holy, and we forget to be whole. And so for me, justice is about articulating God in a way that emphasizes your whole humanity as loved. Not, God doesn't love you in pieces. God doesn't love parts of you. God loves all of you, and all of you is manifested so that we can make a better space in this world. So absolutely, my faith undergirds that, and I had to find a way to logically articulate that faith because I had been taught in such a way that didn't give me that. It was, well, Jesus will fix it after, by and by, when the morning comes. You know, I needed to understand, particularly as a millennial, I grew up with the Columbine shootings. I grew up with school shootings. I grew up with 9/11. I'm living in hell. I don't want to be preached about dying and going to hell. I'm living in hell. What are you going to tell me to survive and navigate that now? So absolutely my faith undergirds that because I have to pick up that work and teach people and help people to understand, yes, God is a God of the oppressed. God is for and with us. And we are aligned in doing godly work and to do justice and to do this activist work. So absolutely, they are one and the same for me.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so for me, working in media, obviously my job is to be witty, to be funny, to give people some enjoyment, some entertainment, right? But for me, I feel like my faith kind of keeps me balanced because in that same vein, I can go and I can make a funny joke and call Stacey Dash a deteriorating dust mite. But I can still know that because I'm grounded in my faith and in my morals that I have a job to do and that I need to talk about some social injustices. I need to talk about the Mike Browns, the Tamir Rices. Those things are things that need to be shared. So for me, I think it kind of helps me stay even and evens things out because when you think about media, I think people think that where would God fall into what you do? But it's in us personally. And if it's in you and it's something you believe in, I think it can keep you grounded.
Being in that mindset, trying to work for yourself and create your own path, it can kind of give you an ego where you can kind of forget God and forget that he's actually controlling what you're going through. So for me, I agree with Dani, like I can go from being in this panel to tonight spending at a club where, you know, somebody's probably doing cocaine in a restroom or something like that, and I'm justifying that as me spreading love and spreading my music, which I believe was God's gift to me, which was sharing my passion. but that is very tight rope that you walk because you're literally, I can see how with Killer Mike on Trigger Warning, being on that show, showing that God exists everywhere, that is part of my mission. I don't want to necessarily clean up myself to the point where I wouldn't be in those spaces, but I do want to make sure that when I do work, I consider the purpose behind everything that I'm doing, why I'm someplace, and if that's actually going towards what God called me to do.
So what are you hearing on the grounds in your various communities, in your various networks, from people as it relates to the present faith leaders in your communities, right? What are people saying on the ground, in everyday life about the role and the presence of organized religion within the Black community?
I feel like, so I was coming straight from the front lines of Ferguson, born and raised in St. Louis, walked the same streets that Mike Brown walked every day. I was in the streets for over 300 days. I was on tour when the uprising kicked off, left the tour to be in the streets with the people. What I hear and what I see is that they just ain't there. And what I hear also and what I see is that there's still very much like the stringent conformity that the church tries to apply to situations. So like when it's a group of people with bandanas on and their shirts off and they got tattoos, and it's lesbian women on the front line, or it's homeless, actual real life, true to life homeless people that we ain't gotta go find. You're gonna get in your car, you're gonna drive right by them, you're gonna see them. Drug addicts, folks in prison, we ain't writing them, we ain't reaching back to get the lost. We perform like we are. We put on a performance art that would suggest that we are, but it's just theater. It's just theater for the folks that are watching, and like this type of situation for entertainment. Like the fact that people are actually dying, going to jail, don't have food to eat. There was one of the sisters on the panel, the last panel, brought up a very good point. The church makes a lot of boastly claims about who the church is and what they do and how they do it. So this generation is going to say, hey, I want to see the receipts for what you claiming you're doing. Right. And it's not even like people are asking folks to do like the craziest stuff. Like I'm not asking you to go outside and feed 500 people by yourself. I'm asking you, if you say you about that, be about that, because I'm going to assume you about that. So when we were out there, some of the young kids came to the pastors and said, y'all need to stop chanting no justice, no peace, because we mean no peace if it ain't no justice. Y'all don't necessarily mean that. Y'all gonna go home if it ain't no justice. So there's a friction between the identity and the mission statement.
I'd like to piggyback off that to also raise Reverend Dr. Guidry's point previously about the promises of the institution. So when I talk about what I hear on the ground, in addition, or under the umbrella of Unfit Christian, I run what has become a digital church called the Unfit Christian Congregation. So, and they're represented here today. So it's a group of about 3,000 of us, and so we're having these conversations, so I hear it frequently. The church is a business. There's the business of church, and then there's church business. And what I'm hearing is that I've been promised these things, this system of reciprocity. I've been taught God in a framework of reciprocity. And here I am doing what I've been told to do, which is the giving, the serving. I'm here, I'm showing up, but I'm not getting back. And what happened to this God that was supposed to do that for me? And even if I just don't blame it on God, and I'm also hearing, what happened to the church that is supposed to do that for me? So I'm showing up to the church in the way that they have asked me to, and I'm not getting back what I need. So I've become disillusioned. I no longer wish to participate in this structure, this institution that is no longer serving me. So now folks are trying to figure out, in my space, in the lanes that I've been running, how do I still retain community? How do I still retain shared like-mindedness? How do I now, I've only known God in the space of the sanctuary. How do I now learn to really understand, express, articulate worship, experience the fullness that I would in a worship experience outside of these churches that clearly no longer serving me, because they're still preaching about holiness is right, but I just watched another black body get gunned down by state-sanctioned violence. They're preaching to me that I need to, as a woman, be silent, or I need to not walk in the spirit of a girlfriend. Come on now, come on now. But I'm watching my pastor not live what he's teaching. So you got folks who are in that space, and they're asking for it. For the most part, I don't find too many people saying, well, it's either church or nothing. They want a space where they can really fully articulate and understand more. So it's not just speaking what they want to speak, but also download that knowledge. They want these spaces, but they don't exist in these churches because these churches want to compartmentalize parts of these people. We'll love the giving part of you, but we don't want to love the lesbian part of you. We'll love the serving part of you, but we don't want to love the disability that requires us to adjust how we do service because we've always done things these way. You know, so you have people who are at this impasse, and it's not I want to walk away from God, but I only know God through the institution, so how can you frame God for me outside the institution? That's what I'm hearing, and that's what I think all of us on this panel and the panel before me are struggling to answer. Yes. Even those who are non-religious. How do we find community? Particularly, it's a particularly bold move to decide to be a Black atheist. Let's be very clear. That is not an easy choice. And a deeply church, deeply religious community is not an easy choice. So how do we even build spaces where we put aside the religious differences and understand that we're all working towards an ethic of justice? And if you have church spaces who want to save you before they listen to you, how do you want me to participate in community?
You brought some stuff out. You named it, right? And I think that we have to deal with it because it's out there, right? And the beauty of this conversation is that when it's put out there, when you're talking about Black millennials, we do not skirt around things, right? And so bringing up the labor and the work, and again, I really want to ground us. We are at a women's college, right? And so to ground us in that conversation and talking about the work and the ethic, how do you see religious spaces, and we talked about it at the last panel, about is there care happening around Black women, right? But how do you see religious spaces as doing the work of, and Nichelle kind of talked about it, but I really want you to name some of the harm, right? Because I think that in naming the harm, we can begin to identify some of it, right? So we hear it and we hear it and we hear it, but the beauty of this space is that to name it and to put it out there and to talk about it. So I would like to hear, what is the harm, right, that we find in a lot of our religious spaces, organized religious spaces that are done on the backs of Black women, in hopes of sometimes being progressive, in hopes of, you know, being catchy or relevant, right? What is some of the harm that's been done?
If I may call a thing, we have to acknowledge that the pulpit is the last bastion of Black male supremacy. It is primarily a way in which Black men find power that is not given to them by a white supremacist world. Within that, there is an articulation of women's place that will always leave us hurting at the intersection of our identity. We're both Black and we're women, but we've always got to sacrifice one, and that's usually our womanhood, in order to honor our Blackness and uphold our Black men. Now, I do not want to have my words mistaken that I despise our Black men. That is not at all what I'm saying. We need to partner, but when you're still trying to hold on to power, and you're still trying to create a space wherein there is a power inequity, how can we do justice? So you're teaching women harmful ideology around their bodies. I have more women coming to me initially with the initial harm being, I was taught my sexual pleasure was a sin. I was taught my body was a conduit of a man's downfall. I'm being taught all of these things that have made me hate myself. I can't even enjoy sexual pleasure because I have this one side of me. I want to be saved, and I want to walk in a holy place, and I want God to affirm me, and then I want to be respected by my church, but I also want to have an orgasm. I also want to experience the joy of sexual pleasure. And I can't do that because I have this mindset that has been put into me by the man of God that I trusted with my spiritual life. And so when you have, again, that last bastion of power being maintained by men, they're not letting women into the pulpit who can liberate us.
Yes.
The ones they do let into the pulpit re-articulate the patriarchy, because let's be very clear, not all gatekeepers of patriarchy and supremacy are white and male, okay? So when we consider that, there's this ever-present harm that once you start oppressing one sexuality, so now I'm going to move on to my sisters, we start competing with the gay men in our church. So now we want to put them on the altar of sacrifice because we want to take some of the pressure off us, so we're going to start saying, yeah, it is a sin. That's filthy. He shouldn't be laying with that man like that. We start to gatekeep supremacy and patriarchy in a way to preserve ourselves. So now we're doing harm to another marginalized group. And so it just becomes this cycle of who can marginalize the next person within a group of already marginalized people, because the goal here is not about transformation. The goal here is not about being renewed by transformed by the renewing of our minds, but it's about maintaining a power structure within another power structure. That's the greatest harm. Until you decide that it's not about the power, but about empowering, we're going to continue to have these cycles wherein we keep doing this harm.
Very real examples of when our brother talks about the absence of clergy people or the church from protests and marches. Very real example is my home congregation's preacher telling the church from the pulpit when millennials are saying Black Lives Matter, that you got to be careful who you follow. And we know very clearly that the reason you have to be careful who you follow is because it's Black queer women. And we don't want to give over any power or any authority to those types of people. And so what I'm seeing, the real harm is how women value themselves. And so when they're coming to me for a reading, for instance, it's always rooted in self-worth. Literally 80% of the time it's self-worth, because we are not taught that we are sacred. We are not taught that our bodies are holy. We are not taught that we are divine, that our pleasure matters, that our wholeness matters. And so we are stuck in a loop of a religion that keeps us struggling instead of thriving. We know how to hope in perpetuity, but we don't know how to, manifest a better reality for ourselves, because we're stuck in wishing and praying for better instead of being in real community with each other, supporting each other, being vulnerable with each other instead of attacking everybody, as Danielle said.
Oh, yeah. I had something to say, but Danielle pretty much brought that up. But I'm going to go back to the last question, because I think as a radio personality, I hear a lot of different things on the ground, right? So I hear a lot of different women calling in, and I'm kind of in the middle, right? Because as a millennial, the generation of gospel radio is not us, right? It's mama, it's grandma. And so they're fighting with us about what we're trying to do, like have these kind of conversations. And so when they hear young women, millennial women calling in, and me and Teddy, we talked about this. I had a woman call in, and we were talking about conversations we don't have at church. And she said that when she got pregnant, which we know is always a problem, she said she felt like the devil herself. The church treated her like the devil. And for us to hear that, right, is crazy, because you feel like you go to church to be loved on, right? You feel like you go to church because it's the hospital. You're going to get a good word. Mama going to come hug on you. And you felt like you're the devil, right? So I think what Danielle said, what Dr. Nichelle said, like you can't compete with what y'all just did. But I want to say that what I'm hearing from us, Mama don't do a lot of calling in to say that. But when we call in, we have real life concerns, right? That we feel like we can't get out. We have real life concerns that we can't be ourselves, right? Because if you're a Christian, if you're young, you can't like hip hop. You can't do this. You can't do that. And so for me, I'm trying to fight against that, because I never wanted to do gospel radio, because I felt like I had to be a certain way. I had to talk a certain way. I had to dress a certain way. I had to walk a certain way, because that's essentially what we're taught, right? We're all taught to move the same thing, which is confusing for me, because if as a body, we all have different gifts. I can never be Danielle. I can never be you. I can never be you. And that's the purpose of this. We're all supposed to move in our unique purpose in order to glorify God. But if people are teaching us, you got to be a certain way, then we're not really moving together. And so I'm fighting against that every single day to say, this is what you're going to get, whether you like it or not.
Right.
So, and it's just what I have to deal with. Why aren't you talking about Kirk Franklin every day? Because Kirk Franklin ain't in the news every day. So yes, I'm going to talk about Beyonce on the gospel station because Beyonce did something. I'm going to talk about what else be happening. Stuff that happens because that's real life.
Right.
Yeah, that's real life.
It's not Kirk Franklin.
Right, yeah. Like, why are you talking about it this way? Because it's real life. So I'm fighting as a woman every single day to be uniquely me, to be walking in the purpose that God set for me, to be loud, colorful. They put some little sparkly red lips on me, and this is me. This is me loving God, being me, and that's all I know how to be. And so I think that, you know, we fight as women against that, and I'm sure you deal with that all the time because we're taught you gotta be like this. And I don't wanna be like that. And so we, you know, these conversations are necessary for that because women are struggling.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back to something my fellow Dani said about a pastor's message that he used to uplift women that I just felt was demeaning. Pastor John Gray had this message about walking in the spirit of a girlfriend, don't walk in the spirit of a girlfriend, walk in the spirit of a wife.
Girl, when don't he have a problematic message, though?
Girl, so look, I have a real problem with pastors pandering to women's insecurities.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
To try to use that as a way to get praise. I just have a real issue with that. I don't like that it's preached that a man is your ultimate reward.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. Do this and you're gonna get a man. Why can't you do this? Why can't you walk this way? Why can't you dress this way? Why can't you act like a wife? Why don't you tell these men that? Why are you worried about what I'm doing? I don't like that. So I have a really big issue with pastors who really lean into women and they want to bash women and say what we're doing wrong. Look at all the men in your church and talk to them first. Don't talk to me.
If I could piggyback off that just like 1 second, I promise. To your point about what we're being taught, what we're being indoctrinated with, this formula. If you do this, 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 you'll end up with a husband.
Yeah.
What happens when that formula doesn't work?
Then what?
Then what? You've got broken women walking around here still trying to hold on to this faith and ideology of, well, if I just keep living right, if I just keep saving myself, if I keep praying for this man, if I just keep taking. What are we teaching about the formula when it doesn't work?
Yeah. It ain't working for me.
Come on, daughter. So yeah, I mean, I had to say that because I think that's just so paramount when we talk about what harm.
Yes.
We're also not talking about addressing when what we have taught doesn't come to fruition. That's just further harm. We keep them in this perpetual cycle of hope and expectation that's never coming. I wrote a piece on my blog called Boaz is never coming and neither are you if you keep waiting. And in that, I broke down, you know, we're taught Ruth as this paragon of womanhood and how
y'all, some of them just got it. They just got it.
They
just got it.
Some of y'all will get it in the car. But I broke down the story of Ruth that she's taught to us as churched women, this paragon of what womanhood should be. And we're taught that Ruth was found working, not twerking. She was found, okay, I need you to get some commentary by a trusted source. I need you to really find out what feet means in the Old Testament, okay? Because feet ain't always feet. And she wasn't just laying at his feet that he walks on, okay? She did a little work to secure the bag. That was survival sex, and we need to teach it as such. Naomi and Ruth both of them lost their husbands. Naomi had lost her sons. In a patriarchal society, their money came through the men in their lives. So when you got people trying to survive, how else are they going to do it? They're going to use the one thing they know. In the words of Ronnie and Tricks, you got to use what you got to get what you want. And so I bring that up to say is that, you know, again, we're taught these formulas, we're taught these paragons, and then even sometimes the basis on which those things have been taught is such bad theology. It's such poorly framed religious ideology, but we just keep spoon-feeding it over and over and over again to each new generation and at each women's prayer breakfast, and harm. Yes. That's continual harm because, as was stated earlier by Reverend Wortham, I believe, you trust your leader. So you're not going to do the investigative work. You're going to trust that your leader is giving you what is true to be to the text and to what has been spoken of God. So you're not going to perhaps do the research. So yeah, you do stay in this continual cycle of harm because you're staying where you think you're being fed and you're just not knowing why it's not working and your pastor's not addressing it. Continuous cycle of harm.
So I want to ask this question, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience. Time goes by really fast, you all. In following up with that, in what ways are Black women beginning to take hold of their spiritual formation and self-care? So, right, we talk about there's harm. So what are Black women doing? What are you doing, right, to heal, right, from this trauma? What are you doing to create avenues for self-care, right? Avenues for spiritual awakening, avenues and spaces where you can thrive, right? Outside of these patriarchal, harmful spaces.
I can't speak to necessarily what we're doing outside without speaking to what we're doing inside, because I truly, as a political person, as a spiritual person, believe in the inside-outside strategy at all times. Is we're talking more about reproductive health in a way that in the church body has been continuously only about one specific type of reproductive health service. And we're broadening that conversation to say, no, we need you to be accountable when we're speaking up. When the reason we're at the altar is because we're deciding if we're able to do one thing or another, if we have enough money to have another child. And we need you at the table with us and talking about the range of reproductive health options. Just this past week was the anniversary of a Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade. 1973, the decision on the basis of the right to privacy around a specific type of reproductive health service. And in that conversation about culminating the anniversary and how many people who, whether they've been in church or not, have been able to access this service, I received so many trolls. We call them trolls online. They were blowing up my Facebook. It's all so public. As public officials, we can't delete any of this. It's illegal now if I was to, yeah. But these are conversations that I wish I would have one African American or Black clergy person stand up with me and say, she is right for standing up for these women who are at my altar on Sundays about their health. Because right now, the people who are adverse with me, I'll say on this issue, I call them anti-choice, I'm pro-choice, are mostly white Christians who are saying, I will face God, I will face Satan, I will face all of this for my standing up for these women. But I'm the one who's holding her hand and walking with her to the pulpit. So what I would say what we're doing is we're requesting intentionally that we talk more about the full range of reproductive health options. And I want to pledge my public support. If there's anyone in the audience here who is seeking health services or who wants to bring this conversation to their congregation, I will come, I will moderate, I will bring facts, I will bring clergy members who are willing to do it, because I don't believe we should be pushed out of our churches. I tried that for a little bit, and it just didn't work out for me. I wanted my spiritual revelation around my reproductive health options as a queer Black woman in the South who's a millennial, to be supported by my religious institution, not for my religious institution to then stand and push me further down, because I already have other people doing that. And I just want to thank you all, if I don't get to speak again this evening, for being here, for making it, making it clear that on Saturday nights in Atlanta, we can do so many things at once, and for really taking this message back into your community, showing someone who is in another city that this talk is coming and that they should be present and they should stay there and they should allow for the televised versus real stuff to happen, that we should have more millennials in this space. This space should be packed. There are so many millennials who are hurting and are asking for talks about God. And let's talk about it, and let's do it on a Saturday night. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I love that the Congresswoman offered her services and offered herself up to serve Black women, because that's what I'm seeing Black women do. We're turning to each other to care for ourselves, to take care of each other. In the community that I have, it's primarily a digital community, but we are taking solace in one another, and we're teaching each other how to center ourselves and start taking care of ourselves the same way that we pour into these organizations that we heard a resounding no from the last panel that are failing us, right? And so I'm connecting to God's creation. I am aligning myself with moon cycles. I am making sure that at least on the new moon and the full moon, I'm taking spiritual baths, and I'm teaching the women in my community to do the same thing, to prioritize our care. I'm mothering myself, and I'm teaching other women to do the same thing. And when we do that, when we center ourselves, we're doing the work that I think that we're missing from the church. We're not feeling like we're getting tended to, we're not getting the care, so we have to do that for each other. We have to love each other and support each other, and I mean, Black women do it every day, and so it's very important that we keep doing the same thing until the institutions, step up to the plate.
So I want to pose some questions from the audience, and I'll put them out there and allow you to respond. The first question is, and it states, anyone can congregate. So what makes the church more than a congregation? If we change to better fit with the times, what is it that distinguishes the church from a social club? The next question, is it possible that the trend of questioning faith has been the same as generations before? We just have a better, more efficient way to collect data, right? And then the last question is coming from me.
You ain't in the audience.
If a spiritual autobiography was written about your lives 30 years from now, what would the opening and closing sentence of the book be? And what would the title of the book be? And I want to hear that from all of you. If a spiritual biography was written 30 years from now, what would be the opening and closing sentence of the book? And what would the title of the book be? And I'm going to ask you to kind of rapidly go through that, but I want to also pose those two questions. So we'll do my question last, and then if someone has responses to those two questions from the audience.
I feel like we're living in like unconventional times. And when I go to the gym, my personal trainers say to get what you never had, you got to do what you never done. So if you want to keep repeating the same thing over and over, that's on you. But people are dying, you know what I'm saying? And they're dying by unconventional means. They're creating stuff to kill us off every day. So if you want to keep repeating things that have not necessarily addressed that issue, then that's your problem. I'm going to move ahead. I'm with the order of progress. So whatever is progressive, that's what I'm going to get with. And I'm not talking about like the Fox progressiveness, like the word progressive that white people have co-opted when they're really not progressive at all. I'm talking about real progression. So like, at this day and age in the Black populace, we got to address the fact that Black women are the most progressive in many cases. The church sometimes, all too often, is duplicating this stale, intellectual, heterosexual Black man that can't think about nothing but A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Then they come up with these wild, concocted conspiracy theories about how this is an agenda, and it just don't even make sense. You got Negroes that think the earth is flat. So like, but the church is not doing anything to address that and reverse this intellectual freight train that's just going off the deep end. So, excuse my French, but in a sense, we're creating a generation of stupid niggas. So, I'm trying to be with who is moving forward, who's addressing what we're going through, where's the spiritual hospital at? Sometimes you get that just in a conversation with a sister that got a different understanding of feminism than you do. And all too often as men, we don't want to address, like, we scared to use the word sexism, we scared to use the word homophobia. We act like, oh yeah, it's just the end of the world if we talk about these things. And I spoke at an AME convention, and the pastor said the church got to be the church. I said, well, for the last 300 years, the church been pro-slavery, the church been pro-prosperity gospel, where you just go to the pulpit and blatantly lie to these people like paying their tithes is gonna make them a millionaire. So if that's what your church gotta be, then by all means be your church. A bunch of criminals, a bunch of liars and a bunch of hijackers. So I'm not rolling with that. And if we have to remodel that, then I'm with that. But also you gotta remember that Jesus was the Messiah that came to remodel that. Jesus didn't die because he was praying and they said, oh man, you the son of God. He died because he walked in the temple, flipped over their tables. He told their government they was BSing, and he challenged the state directly.
That's
If
right.
you in a church that's not challenging the state, you in the wrong church. So even though I have converted to Islam, the Quran talks about Jesus just as much as the Bible does. A lot of people, it's another thing, that's why I'm not with it. I'm not with the stale intellectual crap. Just because you from the hood don't mean you gotta be stupid. They both Abrahamic religions.
Right.
Yeah.
If you read, you would know that.
Right.
So we have examples of how to deconstruct this stuff over and over. And we all want to claim to be pro-black. The most righteous thing you could do as a pro-black person is align yourself with black people that you may not agree with. I don't want to be in the room with people I agree with 24/7. And then I'm gonna wrap it up because I know I'm going on a rant. But also, the church should not be the gasoline to the racist white evangelicals. Like, if white evangelicals that are diehard racists feel comfortable in your presence and you claiming to be a Christian, that's a problem. When I didn't feel good when I saw Barack Obama go to the church in North Carolina, and which he ain't even a Christian by spiritual means, he's a Christian by political means. He was raised Muslim. So I'm not even with a man going to the podium after they shot up a church and talking about we shall overcome. Overcome what? Overcome what? It's blood on the wall. They just walked up in here and killed us. That wasn't a victorious moment. So, and the answer to that question about the book, I'm actually writing one. It's called Rebel to America. It'll be out next year.
Congrats.
So for the sake of time, I'm going to ask you to answer the question I posed to you. If a spiritual biography was written about your life 30 years from now, what would be the opening and closing sentence of the book, and what would the title of the book be? I'll start with you, DJ Hourglass.
Okay. I'd say the book would be called With Every Grain, referring to sand and hourglass. The first sentence would be, I was lost. The final sentence I'm hoping would be, God was within.
Timil.
I would say the title of my book would be Sacred Sister Friend. The opening sentence would probably, she had no idea how powerful she was. And the closing sentence would be, she helped others recognize their own power.
Danielle.
Could you have asked a harder question? Faith Disrupted would be the title. I would open it up by saying there is room at the cross for all of us, no matter how radically different our approach to God is. I would close it by saying God is with us, for us, and is encouraging us to always do justice for all of those among us.
Dani.
Oh, Lord. I think the title would be called Dani's Devotion. I think the first sentence would be, Danyelle found God in her own way. The last sentence would be, oh my God, it's about to rhyme. Danyelle did not follow John Gray.
You gonna go again? Okay.
Tef.
I'm gonna be short. I'm writing a book. It's called Rebel to America. It'll be out next year. It's about my life as a person going through many different things, trying to discover myself, and I came to this point where I'm at right now.
I'd say Parks Pulpit would be the title, and first sentence would have something to do with she was saved and queer, and something around the end would have to be around the journey continuing. You know, it continues.
Krystal.
This is a tough question. I think the title of my book would be She Had No Idea What She Was Doing. And I don't really have an open and close. It's just, for me, obedience is better than sacrifice. I'm just trying to be obedient in a crazy world. Just trust the God when it don't make no sense a lot of times.
Give all of our panelists a round of applause. The night has gone by fast, but keep the conversation going on social media, hashtag God Talk, hashtag Black Faith. We are indeed grateful to the work of our hosts, Spelman College. It has been a privilege to host this conversation here at the historically Black college, Spelman College, which has just been delightful to work with. I also want to thank my colleagues at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I also want to thank everyone for coming in, the volunteers from Spelman, all of my colleagues. Again, follow the conversation. The next conversation for God Talk will happen in Chicago. So join us in September. More information to come for God Talk Chicago, where we, again, will pick up the conversation to find out what's going on with Black millennials and how we're choosing to engage with faith, or how we're choosing to walk away from faith traditions when they no longer serve us. Again, good night, and thank you so much.